Hi, everyone. It's Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. I'm going to give folks a few more seconds to join, but thanks for being here. And 1 sec, please. Okay. So again, thanks for being here. This is Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. And it's been a busy week here in Washington. We had the House come out with their transportation bill, at least the policy part of that. And then just yesterday, the Senate Commerce Committee released their part of the bill. So I'm going to talk about that as well. Okay. Let me see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to focus mostly on the House Invest Act, talk through our priorities of transportation, safety, and then complete streets, talk through the climate. And as I do this, I'm also going to talk about what was in the Senate bill so you can sort of see what those next steps will be. Oops, sorry. So this bill, the Invest in America Act, it is very similar to what the House released last year. It's the full name is Investing in a New Vision for the Environment and Surface Transportation. Some basic highlights of it is that this bill covers the highways portions of it, the highway and roads, the transit, and then the safety, the behavior safety side of things. So this includes both what we saw in the EPW bill, and then for the safety part, what we'll see in the commerce bill in the Senate next week. It includes over $5.5 billion in member designated projects. So those are basically earmarks. And what they did to accommodate the earmarks is that the first year of the bill is going to stay the same as the FAST Act, and the additional funding goes to the earmarks. And then all the changes I'm going to talk about start in 2022, fiscal year 2023. So that starts October 1st of 2022. And the thinking there was twofold. One, to do the earmarks to make the bill as bipartisan as possible. And the other is that there's a lot of changes to how the transportation system would work in this bill. So it would give the US DOT some more time to figure that out. So we look at the highlights, it's 494 billion over 5 years. So the highway and roads portion is 319 billion. That's the portion we mostly care about for biking and walking. What's different this year versus last year is that the Senate bill is almost at the same level. So there won't be as much negotiation between that. And both of them are a good 50 billion more than the FAST Act, which we're under now. It also includes a significant amount of money for transit and for rail, which we haven't seen on the Senate side. And then there's also money for vehicle safety. And a big piece of that 10 billion, they've specifically earmarked to go to vehicle standards. So, and again, the first year is going to stay with current programs. So when we look at our priorities, we again got most of what we asked for. So we got all of the changes we want to see in transportation alternatives. We got, for safety, we got what we asked for, but in a slightly different way than the Senate. And I'll talk about that. Policy changes, again, we got the complete streets guidance in there with and it says requirement, but because complete streets is the idea that you have to consider all users, that's what this requirement is. It's considering all users, but then there's very specific guidance and criteria on how you do that. And then for this, there is a performance measure on accessibility. So how well does the transportation system work in getting people from where they are to where they want to go, regardless of mode? So for increased funding, when we're looking at biking and walking, there's a significant increase in the funding. What I would say about transportation alternatives and safety, funding overall is lower than in the Senate bill, but remember, this is only the increase is only for 4 years versus the Senate bill, which is 5. So once you get to 2023, the House has, at least for transportation alternatives, has a slightly higher dollar amount, but overall it would be a little lower. The House bill also has a new Safe Streets for All program separate from our safety ask, which was great. It also has that Connecting America's Active Transportation, that idea of a bigger grant for a community to build out their network. So that's in here as well. And there's one of the biggest differences is that the House bill includes a lot more money for climate, all of which biking and walking would be eligible for. Okay, so I'm gonna move to talk about transportation alternatives. I'm gonna just, if you'll excuse me for a second, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second. I just needed to make sure I was recording. Thanks, sorry about that. So when we look at transportation alternatives, remember transportation alternatives is a program where roughly 50% of all the funding for biking and walking comes out of, and it's based on the concept of both competition, that local governments are applying for that money, but also local control, that this is about a small amount of federal highway dollars getting down to the local government for local priorities. So the way it works now, it is capped at $850 million a year. The state gets their portion. The recreational program comes off the top, 50%, and then the rest, the transportation money, that other 100% goes out through a competitive process. The state gets 50% where they can run a competitive process or they can transfer it, but that is open to anybody. And then the other 50% gets divided into 3 buckets based on the population size of a community. And then they compete within those pieces. But the large metropolitan areas, those areas of 200,000 or more population, that MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, gets to award those projects. They get to decide where that money is going to go, but they don't have the authority right now to obligate that money, to actually sign the contracts, get the money, get the project underway. So what we asked for in this is we wanted to change the funding from that $850 million to be 10% of the larger surface transportation program. And that way that money would grow every year with the rest of the bill. We also wanted to give the state's DOT some flexibility, and that would be flexibility to help with the local match. So if it was a safety project, they could use safety dollars to help with it. They could also meet that 80-20 match as a program at the project level, at the multi-project level, or at the program level. So if you had some projects that were getting a higher than local, that were offering more than 20% as their match, the state could then use that to help with low-income communities. It also allows the state to hold 5% back to do technical assistance. Because one of the things we've heard from states is sometimes they're getting applications that are not of a high enough quality to fund, but maybe a good project. This would allow the state to use some of their funding to answer that. Okay, I am sorry, my screen just went away. Okay, so on another change we wanted in the funding is we wanted 2/3 to go to that population side and 1/3 to stay with the state side. That would allow the funds to, that would allow more funds to go out on the local government side and less to be transferred. So what that means is small communities would have more money, the MPOs would have more money. Then, so So that's sort of the funding and the state flexibility part of this. The local government side, we wanted those MPOs to be able to have obligation authority. So not only could they choose the projects, but they could actually sign the contracts, get the money moving. They can do this with other funds that they get. We want it with transportation alternatives. We also wanted small MPOs to be eligible. Right now they're not. And then when you talk about the 50% that could be transferred, we wanted to limit that transferability. We need to find a way that we could maintain that local control aspect of the program, but also keep some state flexibility to make sure that it could pass Congress. The other thing we wanted to do is prioritize high need communities, but it would allow the state to define what high need means and how that happens. Sorry for the barking. So here's what we got. Basically, we got everything we asked for. Yeah, so in the House bill, we got everything we asked for. In the Senate bill, we got everything except for that, the 6634, we got 5941. So what that means is that if there's a bill and these two bills get conferenced, all of that should be in there. There's not a lot of wiggle room in between. And then one final change I just want to mention in terms of eligible entities is that the bill was written so that states wouldn't be eligible, because we didn't want states to be able to compete in a competitive process where they're the judge. But what we found was that some local governments would like to work with the state on that application process because maybe they don't have the capacity to do it, or, you know, we hear from some of the smaller communities. This would allow that. So if a local government invited the state to help them with an application, they could do so. And again, that's in both the House and the Senate bill. A couple of things that also changed. One thing the House did was they added in some language around project delivery to direct the Secretary of Transportation to help find solutions to improve and simplify the permitting process. So as many of you know, sometimes it can be really difficult to get these small projects off the ground, that going through that permitting process, going through the labor process, it can just really slow down that. So you might be building $100,000 worth of sidewalks. You may be spending $30,000 of that on the permitting process. We don't want to weaken any environmental controls, but we did want to see for small projects, can we make that project work better? We've been talking with the committee about that. In the end, we didn't come up with any very specific asks that would work in the bill. So instead, there's this language that says, Secretary of Transportation, you are directed to do this. You're required to figure out how we can make this process work better for projects that are small, low impact, and constructed within an existing built environment. Now, I've made that red here because it's in the House bill, it's not in the Senate bill. So when we get to that conference committee, this is something that we're still going to have to continue to advocate on. One of the things that's in both bills is better accountability to make that. Right now, states are doing annual reports on their transportation alternatives projects to FHWA, but they're it's a little bit of apples and oranges, and we just want to get it as specific as we can. So, and then just funding levels in the House, it starts at 1.5 billion, just about a little less than 1.5 billion in 2023, and we'll go up to 1.6 billion in 2026. So we're at 850 now. That's, I haven't done the math, but it's like an 80% increase, I think. So then I'm going to turn to safety programs. So remember, our goal was to create a situation where states that have high levels of vulnerable user fatalities are actually spending some of their safety dollars on that money. Right now, vulnerable road users, bicyclists, pedestrians, people in wheelchairs, people using scooters, we make up 20% of the fatalities. 1 in 5 of the deaths on our road is a bicyclist or pedestrian, and we're getting roughly 1 to 2% of the safety dollars. And that was something we wanted. We wanted to integrate vulnerable road user safety into how the states think about road safety writ large. And so there was a lot done in safety, both in the House and the Senate bill. This bill requires every state to do a vulnerable road user safety assessment. It puts some safe systems language into the strategic highway safety plan and into the program. It increases funding, and then there's a national road safety assessment. So, and this is new. Last year, the House only required half the states to do a safety assessment, and the Senate didn't require it, just incentivized it. But now you can see here's the requirements for the House. All the states have to do it. They have to look at the locations of fatalities and serious injuries. They have to look at design speed. They have to identify the high-risk areas. I think in the House bill it says specifically the corridors, and develop a program of projects and strategies to reduce it. The House also requires MPOs to do the same. And MPOs only look at fatalities, not serious injuries, because we don't have the serious injury data at the MPO level. And just, there was a question last week in my webinar about the Senate bill about, well, can they just say, we'll just take bicyclists and pedestrians off the roads, that'll improve safety. The bill specifically says they can't. So there's a little comparison to what we have in the Senate. One of the things I'll say about the bill overall is that it feels like they were sharing this data, or they were looking at each other's language ahead of time, because a lot of it is incredibly similar, which is great. It's going to make it a lot easier to conference these bills. The Senate does include demographics, and specifically of locations. So is this mostly a low-income community, or is this a community of color? So what they did in the House for the funding, so what the Senate did was say, for every state where 15% or more of your fatalities are bicyclists and pedestrians, you have to spend 15%. What the House did is it ranks the states based on fatalities and serious injuries per capita. So it's a different measure. And then those above the median must obligate funds to address safety. And those projects, and then they have to spend that money on projects identified in their safety assessment. Makes sense. The funding is, they look at the 2020 funding that the state got in transportation alternatives, and they have to spend an amount equal to half of that, which is roughly 247 million a year. So this is what it looks like for non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries per capita. This is based on 5 years of data, which I think is what the bill requires. Something to know is that a national definition of serious injury was just activated in 2019. So a lot of the data that this map is based on happened before there was a national definition. So different states had different definitions. So this looks a little different. So for instance, New Jersey falls off of this one, where New Jersey has a really high fatality rate. So that's something we have to watch. If you do it per country just based on fatalities per capita, it's basically just follows the Mason-Dixon line and then a few states in the north, which would not be politically possible. If you compare it to the Senate, these are the maps you can see. So let's see. So you can see how they're different. Yeah, the bluer the states, the more it is. And this is something they'll have to work out in conference committee. It's not that different, but we'll have to figure this out. So you can see, yeah, so someone from Oregon said, our colors are different. So Oregon by the Senate side would get money for safety, by the House version would not. Same with New Jersey. So this is something we need to think through and what we're going to recommend for that. So, and I got a question, is there any language to push state DOTs to more explicitly set lower goals for anticipated fatalities? There is, well, I'll talk about that as we move forward. So comparing the funding on the state, again, we have different triggers, which means different states. How many states would be affected? Technically on the invest, it doesn't have to be 25, but likely roughly 25, because it's not, well, actually above the median, so you get 25 states. Right now under the Senate version, there's 27 states, but you could have 20 of those states go down to have less than 15% fatalities, 15% of the fatalities, bicyclists and pedestrians, and then you'd only have 7 states. So it's a little more variable. There's more money in the Senate program right now, but MPOs are not part of that process. There's another interesting thing where the House says that the state would actually have to obligate the money, not just set it aside, but actually direct it to a specific project, get it much more likely to be spent. Really like that. Not sure how that would be enforced, but love the way that's going. The other thing that's interesting is the Senate bill really tried to integrate vulnerable road user into the whole safety program. And so this money would come out of that. The House does it differently. It says the funding that's going to this could come out of any highway funds as long as it's not transportation alternatives or other local government funding. So, so that gets to safe systems. Like I said, this does revise the HSIP program. It does include the vulnerable road user safety assessment in the strategic highway safety plan. It does integrate safe systems. It does allow up to 10% of highway safety dollars for programmatic work. So you could do the education portion of Vision Zero plans. You could do the program side of Safe Routes to School. All of that is in both the House and the Senate, so all of that should be in the final bill. However, it's not as integrated as the Senate bill. If you remember in the Senate bill, they changed the language from saying an intersection safety project is eligible to saying an intersection project that addresses the safety of all users is eligible. So those are two slightly different things. When we talk about the MUTCD, the House bill, revises the MUTCD to change how speed limits are set. So it gets rid of that 85th percentile. The House bill didn't, that's what the House bill does. The Senate bill didn't do that, but the Senate bill revised the purpose of the bill to be, instead of the efficiency of highways, to be for the safety and access on that. So those are the differences in the MUTCD. So that's going to have to be negotiated. It's possible to get both or neither on that. And so I will say that the House also included a huge another piece of safety where they're saying 500 million a year coming out of the safety program has to go for safe streets for all. It's all suballocated, so it gets some of that money down to the MPO level, which is something we really supported and think would be really helpful, because just, local planners are just much more likely to know where those dangerous areas are. And the eligible projects are things that we would support: complete streets projects, safe routes to school projects, anything identified in that safety assessment, projects for the safe and adequate accommodation of all users. So all of those things we like. Again, this is only in the House bill and not in the Senate bill, so it's going to be hard to keep, but it's a great program. The other thing it includes is this nationwide road safety assessment, which is very much like a vulnerable road user safety assessment, except for this is done by FHWA. So this was added as an amendment last year, stayed in the bill this time. And it requires the FHWA district offices to consult with state and local jurisdictions. And unlike the VRU assessment, Also involves bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organizations. So get stakeholders involved. And then they have to do the same thing. They have to identify unsafe roads in high-risk areas. And one of the things they do that's interesting in this, so the VRU assessment is very specific to the data. Where are the fatalities happening? Where are those high-risk corridors? This includes high-risk areas of whether it's real or perceived danger. So the idea is if there's a road that nobody rides on because it feels super dangerous, that would be included here, where it would be missed by just looking at the fatalities and serious injuries. It also requires the US DOT or FHWA to identify projects and strategies to address the area and to create a national database that identifies those areas and the suggested solution. And I think both the VRU safety assessment and this safety assessment can be a great advocacy tool because it's something you can say to your state, hey, Federal Highways has said this road is really dangerous for vulnerable road users. They even know what has to be done. Why aren't we doing it? You can do the same thing with the VRU assessment. Again, this one's slightly different because there's different stakeholders and they have that idea of perceived danger in it. So we get to looking at some of the other priorities we worked on. One, we talked about an accessibility measurement. Currently, there's no requirement. Our ask was we wanted a pilot. We had that Commute Act bill, which would get more data, more accessibility data to some states and MPOs and RPOs, regional planning organizations. So they could look at that data and help them planning it. So we wanted that and we wanted a performance measure. In EPW, we got the Commute Act included. So we got the data included, the pilot project with data. But in the House bill, sorry, this is the wrong slide. So I'm just gonna have to talk through so this is what we got in the EPW bill. What we got in the House bill is we got the performance measure, which is great. We looked at complete streets. We wanted standards and guidance for, what makes a complete streets policy or project. We also want a state grant program. The EPW has the states create the complete street standards and funds them to come up with those standards and the prioritization. The House bill actually comes up with those standards and guidance that can be used on a project level as well. So EPW being bipartisan, let the states do it. The House was not bipartisan, a little more prescriptive in how that happened. They're going to have FHWA do it. Emergency relief, they both encourage complete streets focus on low income and allowing people to build back as complete streets, not having to just rebuild what's there. And again, both bills have a program to reconnect community so when you have a community where a highway has been built in the middle of it and dividing it, both states are able to, there's funding in there to rebuild it. Sorry about the slide mix up. And one of the things that the House bill did, which was really good, is when you're talking about that reconnecting communities, or you're talking about the climate pieces, it integrates it into all programs. So you can use a lot of different money to do that reconnecting communities. So that could be getting rid of the highway. It could be building over the highway so that you're connecting biking and walking access across the community. When we get to that, we talked about connecting America's active transportation. In the House bill, it's called active connected transportation, but it's basically the same thing. It's a little different. The House funds it for 4 years at $250 million a year. The Senate funded it 5 years at $200 million. Either way, that's going to be a small issue to work out. That program should be in the final bill. All the other details are the same. Performance measures, so it does This also creates a greenhouse gas emissions. It also includes that accessibility measure. And it also says, so this was a question we got earlier about if there's anything about how states cannot explicitly set lower goals. It says no regressive goals, so they can't. So this is an example from New Jersey on the bottom of the slide. There's a little wiggle room in there, so I think states will argue, well, our rate of fatalities is going down, even if our number is not. But that's something we're going to have to push. First of all, we're going to push to get it in the bill because it's not in the Senate bill, and then we're going to have to push to be strong on that. This is just a slide to say that the planning requirements match those performance measures. So MPOs and states, they have to set those goals now for GHG emission. They have to do a vulnerability assessment of infrastructure and think about resiliency over the life of the facility. And the way the House does it is that in order for an MPO to be eligible for a lot of programs, they have to actually do the planning first. This is true for the MPOs getting VRU safety dollars. Finally, in the public process, there's a requirement to consider environmental justice and equity impacts. And that requirement is through almost all of the grant programs as well. Okay. So the climate programs, there's a pre-disaster program, which is basically for resiliency, to improve resiliency. There's a carbon pollution reduction program to reduce CO2. That's at the state level. And then there's a grant program for local governments. And there's other changes throughout. Just like the Senate program, the goal here is to prepare for natural disasters. It can be used to remove and relocate a road or another facility. It can be used to create evacuation routes, increase resiliency, very similar. The carbon reduction program that goes to the states, this is really different. Although the uses are the same, there's actually penalties if you don't reduce your carbon pollution. So every year, USDOT would be required to rank the states by greenhouse gas emissions. And then the states that do the best at reducing their carbon pollution, the top 15 states, there's an incentive for them. There's a reward. They can use the funding in this program. They can use 100% for federal funds. Or they could transfer 50% of those funds over to CMAQ. But the states that do the worst and don't actually reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, there's a penalty in there. They have to take some of their surface transportation program funds, which is a highly valued fund, and they have to spend it on carbon pollution reduction. So I got a question on carbon reduction program. Is there an emphasis on connectivity with trails? It does allow for biking and walking, but there's nothing quite that specific. And that the way the House did it is they did a lot of formula funding changes, and then they did grants for local governments. So there's a climate innovations grant. Again, there's that focus on equity and environmental justice effects and serving low-income communities. And that does have an emphasis on that connectivity for bike-ped transit. And I would say the biggest difference in the climate programs between the House and the Senate, well, there's two big differences. One is that ranking of states and the reward and penalty of that. The other is the size of the programs. In the Senate bill, I think it's about 15 billion, and in the House bill, it's multitudes of that. So that's something to watch. Look at just some other programs. There is new funding for federal lands, a 40% increase. There's also this option of, one of the things that happens, and this is something that happens in the DC area, is that for us, it's the Baltimore-Washington Parkway is actually on federal lands. It's a major commute road, and it's coming out of the federal lands budget. And so this bill would allow the federal lands entity to talk to the states and say, hey, can you help me fix this road? It's your residents who are doing all this driving on it. And so that's in the bill. It allows for that. There is also an amendment to say to actually authorize funding for the federal lands to use on these routes. It was, and I believe that passed, but the funding is authorized. It's not actually funded out of the Highway Trust Fund. There's also a major projects program. So this is fun, similar to a project of national and regional significance that we have on the road program. What they are finding is that the federal projects are not as big as those, but they would take a huge chunk of the federal lands budget. So this is a program to help with those. There's also an increase, I think about the same amount, to the federal lands access program. There's not a lot of changes to congestion mitigation and air quality. It makes bike share and scooter share projects eligible. What it does is it changes the transferability. So right now, states can transfer up to 50% of CMAQ to any other program. Under this, the only place they can transfer it is to the carbon pollution reduction program. The only place they can transfer carbon pollution reduction is to CMAQ. So they're trying to keep that money in the same place and for the same purpose. There's also a program that looks a lot like what was billed and then, or what was Tiger, then billed, now is RAISE, is in here, and it's funded, I think it's at 500 million a year. I'll have to go back and look at it, but it's basically the same requirements that are on RAISE funds now. Yeah, it looks a lot like Tiger. And so, yeah, so that's in there. I'll talk about what's in the Senate side when we get to the other bill. So then when we talk about highway safety, when I talk about biking and walking, I rarely talk about the National Highway Performance Program because there's not a lot of money from this program goes to biking and walking. We do much better under transportation alternatives, surface transportation block grant program, under congestion mitigation and air quality. Because this program is really seen as sort of the lifeblood of building highways, but yet it is more than 50% of all of the road funds. One of the things that the House bill does that the Senate bill didn't was this puts a fix it first policy on it. It says it states that before a state can use any of this funding to build single occupancy vehicle capacity, so before it can build new lane miles for cars, it has to first demonstrate progress and have a good state of good repair. It also has to support the achievement of performance targets. And it has to prove that that an operational improvement or a transit project or some other project wouldn't help more. The other thing that's in the bill this time is it does say that that biking and walking facilities are not part of this. So you could still build biking and walking facilities even if you're not meeting the qualifications under the fix it first policy. So that's sort of adapting. This is one of those things that we saw come out of the president's American Jobs Act, is it has that fix it right, which is improving the safety and accessibility of all users and resiliency. That was adopted into the House program so that the single occupancy vehicle capacity is for drivers. It's not for people biking and walking. So you could still use funds for trails, sidewalks, bike lanes, things like that. Oh, and this is looking at 2020. So you can see the different sizes for that. All right. So one of the things we were working on this year that was a little different was we were trying to focus, we were working with the Transportation Equity Caucus to work on the enforcement programs. And there's two we were working on. One we've talked about is the 1906 program, which is prohibiting racial profiling. It's a Transportation Equity Caucus priority. This program right now, there's only 4, maybe 5 states that actually use it. And the program funds the states to collect the data from their police departments and to analyze it and to look at, what percent of stops, what percent of citations were versus demographic data. So what percent were to people of color, what percent were to women versus men, things like that. In order to do this, the state has to have a policy or a practice of trying to prohibit racial profiling. So this is just, it's rewarding them for that to actually use the data. What we did change in that is doubled the funding for the program, which is great, and also changed the eligibility. So instead of just doing data collection analysis, it now allows for that funding to go for public engagement and to actually try to fix the problem. So not just the analysis, but to fix the problem. One of the things we tried to fix in this is that the way the program is used right now, it's basically just used for drivers. They're just looking at tickets and stops of people pulled over for driving. We worked with Representative Carbajal from California to get an amendment that would also include the data from stops of people biking and walking for a traffic violation. So it would work for jaywalking, for helmet laws, for light laws, for riding on the sidewalk, things like that. It would not necessarily work for a stop and frisk situation. But we have seen that all of those things, jaywalking, helmet laws, light laws, have been used specifically in low-income communities or in communities of color as an enforcement mechanism. And so we wanted to get at that. The amendment, in the end, it was withdrawn, but the committee gave us a promise to work with us on it to try to address that issue. Or they gave that promise to Carbajal, but we're gonna get involved in that. We did not get the changes to the 402 program, but they did create the Center for Fair and Equitable Traffic Safety Enforcement. So this is more of a place to study the issue and do the research. $35 million a year is pretty good funding. Develop data collections to look at equitable traffic safety enforcement solutions, make recommendations to the state, provide technical assistance, research and disseminate best practices. This is not what we wanted. We wanted to require states that were getting any enforcement money to have a policy against racial profiling. And we wanted to collect that data on all of those enforcement programs. This was something, there was a disagreement between sort of the equity caucus groups and the traditional traffic safety groups. So this was the compromise. We'll work within this framework, assuming we get this into a final bill. We'll work within that framework to try to work with NHTSA and actually get better data collection. So that was in the House bill. I want to talk for a minute about the Senate Commerce bill, because the way the Senate works is different. We saw EPW do the highway bill, the highway portion of the bill, the roads portion of the bill. The Commerce bill does the NHTSA section. So that's both what we were just talking about with equity programs, but also vehicle safety. In the House, vehicle safety was not in the bill I just talked about. That'll be coming up later. So when we look at Commerce, the biggest thing they do is rail and railroads. Then they do NHTSA, which we talked about, both the enforcement side and the vehicle safety, and they also control some of the grant programs out of the Office of Secretary. So our interests are on vehicle safety, the enforcement programs, and things like the RAISE grant. And they do have the RAISE grant, formerly Tiger, formerly built. They fund it at $1.5 billion a year, which is even higher than the President's American Jobs Act, which funded it at $1 billion a year. So I'll talk about this. For us, these are the big issues, but just so you know, for the biggest stakeholders are the rail interests. So anything you read about this bill will be focused mostly on the rail funding, and the Senate funding is significantly lower than what the House did on rail. Okay, so other thing, when we talk about vehicle safety, there's sort of three types of required action that you're going to see in a bill like this. The first step is sort of research and study. The second step is issuing a regulatory notice for comment. If you're on our action alerts, you see we do a lot of these. So like, I think we did one like the MUTCD sort of regulatory changes. And then the final step is issuing a final rule. And we've been talking quite a bit about the new car assessment program. That's sort of the 5 stars that NHTSA gives a car about how safe it is, but there's also a lot of detail and data on how is it safe. Up until now, the NCAP has only focused on the safety of the people inside the car, not the people outside the car. This bill does 2 things. It requires a whole new set of data on crash avoidance technology and another on vulnerable road users. So for both of those, they have 2 years to put out that notice. So the middle step, which is good. They have to identify what technologies are going to be considered under this. They're going to have to come up with a performance test criteria that's actually done by the manufacturer. They have to come up with a rating system distinct for that, so that under this, the NCAP, NHTSA's 5 stars would have a distinct rating for crash avoidance technology and another distinct one for vulnerable road users. And then they have to have a plan to update it. All that is really good, and we're really happy to see that. But one of my concerns is that the crash avoidance technology rating and report and test under this law doesn't have to include vulnerable road users. So you could have a rating on a blind spot detection that says it's excellent, but it's never been tested with people biking and walking. Now, maybe we then put that under the VRU piece too. It's a little confusing, and that's something we want to try to fix. Some really good news, and this is a way where the things are integrated, was hood and bumpers. So there's hood and bumper standards, and this gives NHTSA 2 years to issue a final rule. So this is the final step when the process is done, right? On hood and bumper, that has to look at what technology is going to be involved, what it would take to reduce the number of injuries and fatalities suffered by vulnerable road users, what the test is that manufacturers have to do related to and include vulnerable road user safety in that. And then there's a goal to have a global standard, because right now we know that you can have the same make and model of a car, one sold in Europe where they test for this, and then one sold in the house, or excuse me, in the US that doesn't test for this, and the Europe car is safer. Just some other updates, headlamps or headlights. Our last headlight revision was in 1969. There's been a lot of technology improvements since then. They now have adaptive driving headlights that can sort of, they can sense what the environmental condition is and light your headlights to what would be most helpful. That's not allowed here because of our old rulings. So this is the idea, to come into compliance with global standards. And this should make a big difference on pedestrian safety, because where we've seen pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries increase the most, it's been on arterials, and it's at dusk and dawn. And IIHS, the industry testing group, they've shown that headlights make a big difference. And then something that's more on the research and study thing is this idea of driver monitoring systems that can monitor whether you're distracted or disengaged or trying to misuse your driver assist systems. We'll have to see about that. On the underrides for commercial vehicles, it does have requirements for rear underrides. It's all based on what's happening on a highway. There's also a requirement for research on side underride guards. But again, that's the research. That's the first step. There's also a requirement for better crash data. So, and this could be really good. They want the data to be able to disaggregate among vulnerable road users. So was that a scooter crash? Was that a bike crash? Was that a pedestrian crash? Make sure that's separated. It also wants to combine the NHTSA data with the CDC hospital data. So if you've ever looked at crash and injury data, we get much higher numbers coming from the CDC than we do from NHTSA, probably because there's crashes where the police aren't called. And then finally, there's this requirement to create a national pedestrian database for injuries and fatalities. In the marker bill, it said pedestrian database, but it included people biking or using scooters. And so we'll work to try to improve that. There's also a grant fund for states to update their equipment, make sure that their data is going directly, there's a way to send their data electronically or get the data from law enforcement electronically. Seems like in 2021 we should have that, but we don't have it in all states. And then just increase the alignment of the state crash data with federal guidance to make sure that they're collecting everything that is required at the federal level. So the Commerce Bill also has a Safe Streets for All piece, but this is towards the planning piece. It's $200 million a year to do Vision Zero or towards zero death plans. It can be used to create that plan, to conduct the planning, design, development activities. It can also go for enforcement or for education. It does, when they define what a comprehensive safety plan is, they include having a goal and timeline for zero deaths. That's great, but it includes enforcement without any equity safeguards on it, without any equity language. And there's no language in here requiring that a plan just make sure that the benefits of the plan are equitably distributed. That is in the definition of a Vision Zero plan in the House bill. So that's something we're trying to change. Enforcement provisions, we didn't get there. One of the things is, as an equity caucus, we really started working at this late. So we have, while we've done some preliminary visits, we didn't have any language ready, so we didn't get that. However, on the 1906 program, we're going to try to get some amendments that will help get us close to where the House bill is. So I know we're getting close on time. Just quickly on next steps, Commerce is going to mark up. We're going to try to get to Commerce Committee. Remember, the House bill is not bipartisan. The Senate bill is, which means the Senate bill will have a lot more clout. Because when you get to that conference piece, you've got Democrats and Republicans from the House and the Senate. Democrats, from the House and the Senate. The House Republicans are saying they're going to vote for this. They're going to push for the Senate provisions more than the House. So you're going to have a 3-on-1. So this is something we're going to have to continue to work on. I will say DeFazio has done a really good job of trying to bring some of those Republican amendments into the bill. Just so you know, this is what we're talking about. Nancy Pelosi wants a vote on the full bill by July, which means we're going to need a finance title. And if there's going to be vehicle safety provisions, the Energy and Commerce Committee is going to have to go. In the Senate, the Banking Committee, which does transit, and Finance Committee are going to have to go. The plan is then to, in August, sit down and try to combine the two bills into one. How does that work with the American Jobs Plan? Well, that's, and just so you know, there's a question about money for a Greenway stimulus. That was targeted at the American Jobs Plan. Right now, there is $5 billion in that plan for transportation alternatives. So that's where that is. I would say in the two bills, you do have the $1 billion on both of them for building those networks. But for that big extra chunk of money, that money that might come on top of reauthorization, that's the American Jobs Act. That's still in bipartisan discussions right now. There's news today that there might be some sort of high-level deal. we'll have to see. If that bipartisan breaks apart, and that bipartisan is going to be hard because you have to find something that both 10 Republican senators will agree with and the Progressive Caucus of the House will agree with. We'll see. If the Democrats decide to go on their own and use that reconciliation process, they need to do that before September 30th. Right now, the House and Senate with the transportation bill, they're trying to get that done before reconciliation. So that's why we're seeing that flurry of activity, and it's going to be super busy over the next couple of months. I think there's a really great chance we're going to get the reauthorization done. We'll have to see what happens with that larger process. If the Democrats do choose to go through a reconciliation process, which is a process by which they could do it with just Democrats in the Senate, they're going to have to make that decision really soon because there's a bunch of steps that have to happen ahead of time. So that's what we're seeing in the process right now. Yeah, there's the interplay. And I'll stop and answer questions. And I will, the slides will be available, and I have some charts in here that you can see that's going to compare the House and the Senate. So I'm going to stop sharing. All right. So the question was, is there still an opportunity for 10 billion or more in Greenway stimulus funding? That would be under the American Jobs Plan. And you know, we'll have to see how that goes. That's more likely to happen under a reconciliation than a bipartisan section. What I will say is the changes we got on biking and walking has been really bipartisan. We almost had a Republican-only transportation alternatives bill that would have done everything that the Democrat-only bill did, just with different language. So I'm feeling really good about all the pieces that we got in there. At the same time, we did see in the Senate that Shelley Moore Capito, the same Republican who's been bargaining with Biden, say, look, we've done a ton for biking and walking. It's time to look at something else. So I got a question. Is there one thing advocates should weigh in on? Great question. I would say watch your email for Monday. I'm still working through the commerce bill right now. And so that they're going to be taking votes on Wednesday next week. And so what happens is the committee puts out the bill, right, Thursday night. By Monday, we have to know what our changes are, and we have to get an office to support it. We are working for changes for that 1906 program. So if we have an amendment on that, we will let you know. As we get, and then when we get to the finance title, that's when we'll be pushing a commuter act and a rebate for e-bikes. And then the final piece, we're really gonna focus in and ask on who's on that conference committee, right? It won't be all of Congress, it will be specific members. And then if you're members on that, you might get some alerts asking you to really reach out to the staff. So that's a long way of saying, look at your email on Monday, watch Twitter, we may have a big ask then. And then as we get later in July, we may have some other asks coming up. Sorry, I know this is a ton of very specific data, but the good news is we're making progress. We have both, especially on the transportation alternatives and safety, and it's exciting to see the commerce bill take up some of that vehicle safety change. We'll look for that in the next bill. So with that, I'll just ask if there's any more questions. Yes, I will send the slides out. All right, great. Thanks everyone for joining me. We'll get this out to you probably on Monday morning. And for those of you who have a member on the Commerce Committee, you may be hearing from us then on an amendment as well. Thanks.